Yeah. It looks like it may go this time, hopefully. Yes, here we are. Wonderful.
Good.
Okay, psychology social hour. Back to you, Kellen. Okay, so we have Psychology Social Hour hosted by the St. Joseph Museums. Our guest speaker tonight is Miss Kellyn Toombs. She comes to us with a background, an undergraduate degree in history and a master's in museum studies at the University of Arts in Philadelphia. She just moved to Kansas City in September to work for Eisterhold Associates Incorporated. That is an exhibit design firm that creates exhibits for many museums around the country. She has had a particular interest in working with medical, psychiatric history museums throughout her undergraduate and graduate degree career, which led to jobs and internships at 4 different medical museums. Tonight, her topic is going to be ethics and communication of difficult, sensitive topics in medical museums. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Kellyn.
Well, thank you all so much for joining. I can't see those of you who are on Facebook, but welcome. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me pull up my presentation. All right, and then we are going to get started. Awesome. All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Shelley. It's so nice to be here with everyone. I'm so honored that I was asked to speak. As Shelley mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about interpreting historic anatomical collections for 21st century audiences, which is a very difficult topic in medical museums. Human remains are hard to talk about. I do want to let you all know before I get started, there are images of human remains in this presentation. However, I did try to avoid using them as much as possible. If there was a case where I could use an alternate image that was not human remains, I went for that. But there are some images that were taken inside of museums where the remains are just in the background. So just wanted to give you a heads up in case you have like a little one watching on your lap or you're just uncomfortable with those images, totally understand. So as Shelley mentioned, I just moved here to Kansas City in September of this past year. I'm working as a content developer for Eisterhold Associates Incorporated. We're up in Northland. Our address is still technically Kansas City, but it's really closer to Leavenworth. If anyone knows Terra Vox Winery in Kansas City, my boss also owns Terra Vox Winery. So we're actually located on a winery way up in Northland. What I'm a content developer, which basically means I'm a glorified museum label writer. I do a lot of the writing. I do a lot of the research. Sometimes we'll have clients come to us and say, you know, I want a museum about birds, and then I'm the person who has to figure out what kind of birds we put in the museum. So how I got there was I have a master's degree in museum education at the University of the Arts, which I also just finished this past year. And then I studied history and biology at Case Western up in Cleveland. But all that time, I've also been really interested in medical museums. I'll go into the ones that I've worked for, but before I do, I wanted to clarify, I'm not an expert, as you might be able to see. I have a master's degree from an art school, so I'm not a medical ethicist, I'm not a doctor, but I do have some lived experience that I'm excited to share with you all. So please, again, not medical advice that I'm giving you. As Shelley clarified, I wanted to clarify that myself as well. There definitely are medical experts, PhDs out there, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't claiming to be one of them. But I've always loved medical history museums. This is a picture of me during my 2020 internship with the GLORE. Um, I've always been really interested in the history of psychiatry. I actually got into that history because I was really into ghost hunting shows as a kid, and they always go to, you know, abandoned buildings. A lot of times they'll go to abandoned hospitals. And as a kid, I started doing more research online and realizing there's more to this history than just the ghost stories. So that's what kind of got me interested and kind of got me thinking deeper about what's going on in these buildings that we don't get to see so much anymore. I thought it'd be a really cool idea if more of these buildings could be museums, and I was delighted when I saw that some of them were, like the Glore. So I started my career in medical museums at the Indiana Medical History Museum. I'm actually originally from Indianapolis. So when I came home from college in Cleveland, my first summer in college, I immediately went to volunteer at the Indiana Medical History Museum. They are also like the Glore, a former psychiatric hospital, but they're a little bit different. They're actually a former pathology lab that's been turned into a museum. So you walk in and it's almost like a time capsule. So you can see, the old chemistry lab, the old histology lab. It's really, really neat. And then the summer of 2020, I believe around January, I had just cold emailed Sarah Wilson and said, "Hello, do you take interns?" And she said, "Yes, we can take volunteer interns." And I was like, "Excellent, I'll be there." So I ended up doing a volunteer internship in 2020. It was kind of a little bit short because of the pandemic. I was actually only there for 3 weeks, but this museum did make a major impact on my career. Next, I was an exhibition intern at the National Museum of Psychology, which is in Akron, Ohio, of all places. But I worked with them for about a year, putting together an exhibit that's actually still up. If anyone here ever finds yourself in Akron from now until about May, we did an exhibit on the psychology of home. But that's also a really neat museum. They have a lot of not so much psychiatry, but a bunch of artifacts relating to psychology, the history of psychology. I believe actually the Galore has some artifacts on loan there as well. So that's a really neat museum. And then finally, I worked as a gallery guide or a tour guide at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. A lot of this presentation will focus on the Mutter Museum. A lot of this presentation is adapted from my thesis work in grad school, which was inspired by my job at the Mutter Museum. So let's talk about medical history museums a little bit more and why I love them so much. A medical museum, as defined in this presentation, is a museum that talks about the history of medicine. So they have a lot of unique artifacts. Something that you'll see on the left, this is what's called a wax moulage. So this was something that used to be very common for medical students. Doctors would have these made to show off various medical conditions. This one is from the Mutter Museum showing different ophthalmology conditions, where, if you're a medical student in the 1800s, 1900s, might be hard to see all of these medical conditions in person or on a living body. So those wax moulages do a great job of capturing that for a medical student. So they have a lot of these are now in medical museums. Medical museums can also be like this picture of the Indiana Medical History Museum showing old medical equipment, or like this picture from the Glore, recreations of treatments that we used to do. But one thing that medical museums often have that other museums don't have is they have human remains. A lot of the time, these will be museums that were originally teaching museums. It used to be that almost every medical school had a collection of pathologies, tumors or body parts or teeth or just anything that doctors thought would be important to preserve for their medical students to reference later. So sort of similar to how you might dissect a frog in biology class, back when it was harder for doctors to get regular access to cadavers or regular access to patients with diverse medical conditions, when they found a specimen they wanted to save, they often would. So these are really one of the last places where if you decide, hey, I want to see a dead body today, how can I do that legally? And not in a weird way. These medical museums are kind of really one of the last places where you can encounter human remains out in public. So that's something that makes them very unique. Something else I wanted to address is that stolen human remains in particular in museums have been in the news a lot. So especially when this topic comes up, people often think of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation. Oh my goodness, the acronym just flew out of my head, but it involves repatriating human remains that were specifically taken from Native American or Indigenous peoples. So there was a big ProPublica article that came out about a year ago, actually, talking about just how many museums and institutions have stolen Native American remains, taken oftentimes during archaeological expeditions. A lot of remains that still need to be returned, even though NAGPRA was passed back in the 90s. So actually this article is very interesting. You can look up any name of any museum you want. There's children's museums on here, natural history museums on here, science museums, history museums. It's really shocking how many museums have these Native American remains that they still need to repatriate. There's just been the British Museum in particular has also been in the news a lot. A lot of people in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities have been asking for the return of these ancestors that were taken from graves. This has even been a bit on John Oliver's Last Week's Night. talking about all the stolen artifacts in museums in general. So museums get a lot of heat, not just for stolen human remains, but for stolen artifacts. In general, many museums have been kind of reckoning with the fact that they do have stolen artifacts, they do have stolen human remains. We'll talk a little bit more about the Penn Museum later on in this presentation. They're actually reburying some stolen human remains in about, I think that's going to be in early February. But we'll talk a little bit more about why that's maybe not the best thing, or it's been a little bit controversial that they're doing this. The British Museum, of course, we all know they've been kind of in the news a lot for stolen artifacts. They've also been reckoning with, hey, that includes human remains. Where should we go from here? Something that I noticed as a museum studies student was that people tend to kind of poke fun at museums that have stolen things. We tend to acknowledge like, hey, this is not good. There's in particular a lot of jokes about the British Museum online about how, oh, if they gave back everything they stole, there'd be nothing left. This is something that the public seems to, reckon with. This is something that the public seems to acknowledge, oh yes, stolen things are bad. So when my museum, the museum that I worked for, the Mutter Museum, we also started kind of reckoning with this past of, okay, we're a medical history museum. We recently did a study found that 95% of the objects in our museum weren't acquired with patient consent. So we'll get into how those objects got to the museum in a little bit, but what they found is that, a lot of these body parts, like many human remains in museums, were taken without someone explicitly saying, yes, you can have my leg, or yes, you can have my lung when I pass. So I was expecting, as our new director was explaining this to me, she talked to my class, she was explaining, we need to do some reckoning with our past. I thought when that went public that the public would also be like, oh yes, of course, like, of course they need to give back these stolen remains. If the British Museum does, everybody does. Um, but when these news articles started coming out about our plans to kind of look inward, think about, do we need to change our collections? Where do we go from here? The Mutter Museum ultimately decided, I think around March, when I was still working there in grad school, that they were going to take down every video on their YouTube channel that featured human remains. This YouTube channel has, I think, around 100,000 subscribers, so it has a very large audience. But they decided we need to do an internal review, see how these remains are being presented in the YouTube videos. They ultimately weren't planning on, deleting the channel entirely. They were just thinking, okay, let's take these down, do a review, see how the remains are being presented, post the ones that pass the review later. And I don't think we were expecting the level of public backlash that we got. So there was a petition started and a group formed called Protect the Integrity of the Mutter Museum. This petition now has around 30,000 signatures, but within a week it got just thousands and thousands of people saying, no, this is not okay, that they took down their YouTube channel. There was a lot of fear going around that the museum was going to give back these remains. And I thought this was very weird as a museum studies student, because it seemed to me that the public was largely in favor of NAGPRA, largely in favor of giving back stolen human remains. But then when this museum tried to do it, there was a big public backlash that we haven't seen with, the British Museum returning stolen artifacts. So I was really curious about why the public had the reaction that they did to this, and that ultimately sparked the inspiration for my thesis. So I thought, okay, let me investigate this petition, see what's going on here. What are people actually saying? Why are they actually upset? So one thing that I did was I went through all of the comments left on this change.org petition. I took comments, I think about 5 days after I'd been posted. There had been about 500 comments left at that point. But I sorted through, I said, okay, let's sort them. What are people saying? I found that some people were saying they were angry because they found the museum to be entertaining. They always wanted to go, but not to a lame version. They really like that the museum is gross. Some people were upset because they found the museum to be very educational and were worried about censorship, saying there's nothing wrong with looking at bodies that are different. The Mutter Museum does have a very large collection of medical pathologies. We have, a colon that's swollen up big and huge called the megacolon from a man that had Hirschsprung's disease. We have the conjoined livers of Chang and Eng Bunker. Those were two conjoined twins from the country of Siam that they originated the term Siamese twins. We have a tumor from President Grover Cleveland's mouth. There's a wall full of, I think, 100+ different skulls. We have parts of Einstein's brain. So there really are a lot of body parts in this museum that you can't see anywhere else. And some people do think it's very educational in that way, because this is a topic that isn't often discussed in other forums. People sometimes said, this is a place that inspired me to be a doctor. We do get a lot of doctors. When I was working as a tour guide, I'd get a lot of medical students or a lot of high school students interested in medicine. So that was a big one that people were upset about. One that I thought was really interesting was that people also saw the Mutter as a place of humanity, saying that, this is a place where we can see disabled bodies, or as a disabled person, I feel seen at the Mutter Museum. Some people felt that taking these remains down would be ultimately disrespectful. A fourth category that I ended up taking, aside from education, entertainment, and humanity, was nostalgia. A lot of the comments were saying this is a Philadelphia institution, it's what makes us special as a city, or there were a lot of comments just sharing happy memories at the Mutter Museum that were generally resistant to change. So what I found ultimately, comments sometimes mention multiple reasons for why they were upset about this potential change at the museum. Most people found reasons for it to be, to argue the museum was educational, but a lot of people were also very nostalgic for the museum. Empathy and entertainment were mentioned a little bit less. But taking this data, I also looked through, other comments online, other people talking about this, and another pattern I noticed was there seemed to be a lack of education about the museum's history. I saw a Reddit thread, someone was asking, hey, how did the Mutter Museum get all those body parts in the museum? And comments were just saying like, well, people die, or they use tongs. The people that answered the question seriously were saying, oh, well, people with rare diseases will sometimes donate their body. And that is actually true. This woman, her name was Carol Orzel. She passed away in 2018, and she did have a rare bone disease called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, or FOP for short. What FOP is, it's caused by a genetic mutation where if you have, an injury, or it's often brought on by trauma, you can have an FOP flare-up where parts of your body that should not be bone will develop into bone tissue. So Carol's skeleton, it looks like there's extra bone. It looks like she has muscles made out of bone, and that's because she does. But we also have another man named Harry Aslak in the collection. Similarly, when he died, he wanted his skeleton to be preserved because FOP is very, very rare. He was hoping that if his body was preserved and studied, that it would make it easier for doctors to find a cure and to raise awareness. So Carol, when she saw Harry's body, she said, I want that to happen to me when I die too. So her body came to the museum in 2019, I believe. She passed away in 2018. And that was a very public story. It's a very feel-good story because, this museum was able to fulfill this woman's, last wish in a way. So I felt like as I was reading some of these comments, there was a lot of conflation of what happened with Carol Orzel with what was happening in the 1800s. So in the 1800s, doctors were taking things from patients without that consent that we now have today. Whereas today, if someone's coming to the Mutter Museum, if a body part is coming to this museum, which happens very rarely, but when it does, it's because, they consented to it. They wanted their body part to be in a museum. So noticing this lack of kind of information about the museum's history, I was thinking, okay, so as a museum educator, which was what I went to school for, my museum education degree, I was thinking this is an opportunity for the museum to talk to people more about the history of this institution and have these hard conversations. So let's do that today. I'm going to talk to you about the history of these anatomical collections in the United States. There's very few of them left, but we're going to talk about why that is. Also talking about the history of this idea of medical consent. When does someone say it's okay to use their body? What does that mean? How has that idea changed over time? And then how can museum staff educate the public about these topics? What works, what doesn't? Just from my personal experience, trying to explain these topics to tour groups and museums. And then also, what's next? So we have these collections of human remains. Now what do we do with them? All right, so let's dive in. 2 facts I want to share with you. The idea of donating your body to science wasn't really a thing for much of human history. The Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, which made it, kind of set up a national framework across the US for donating a body to medical school. That wasn't passed until 1968. Other schools had policies, a little bit earlier about how they got bodies. But the first medical school in the United States, the University of Pennsylvania, was opened all the way back in 1765. So we have about 200 years of history here where it's like, okay, there's no uniform way to donate a body to medical school, but medical students are still doing dissections. They still need to, learn anatomy. How are they getting these bodies? One way is through executions. Executed criminals for many years were used for anatomical dissections. It was considered part of their punishment, actually, was to be anatomized. They could also sometimes use unclaimed bodies, but there weren't enough unclaimed bodies and executions to meet the needs of medical students across the United States. So what do we do? Doctors would just take. Body snatching is a very real thing that happened. There's a really great Smithsonian Magazine article about it, particularly in Baltimore. What would happen is medical students would hire someone to go out, sometimes they would go out themselves, dig up a body. We're just going to take one. Oftentimes they would target cemeteries where they were unlikely to face consequences. As you can imagine, if you're taking from, a wealthy person, a person whose family can hire a lawyer, that's not going to look so good if you're caught. That's not going to turn out well. So oftentimes they would target Black cemeteries, they would target poor cemeteries. I have a picture here actually of the Indiana Medical History Museum. What you're seeing, that little red brick building on the left was called the Dead House. That was where they would keep the bodies of patients that had passed away until they could be buried or a funeral could be held. Now, as far as I know, no one ever actually got away with body snatching at this institution, but it was something that they had to be careful of because medical students would sometimes also target psychiatric hospitals, knowing that, maybe the family wasn't going to be there to get them in trouble, or maybe this was a person who was marginalized in society. So this is step one of why, these medical collections are a little bit problematic. These bodies were often just taken out of the ground. You're doing your dissection. Maybe the doctor decides, oh, that's an interesting tumor. I'm going to save that for medical students later. So that's one way that they got bodies back for a lot of history. Specimens, they were taken, saved as teaching tools. These are snakes, not humans in this picture, but we have wet specimens. We had these at the Indiana Medical History Museum when they did autopsies of patients that had passed away at the hospital. The doctors told families that if they would let them do an autopsy, they would give them a free funeral in exchange. That got a lot of families to consent to that practice. But because of that, the Indiana Medical History Museum has a very large pathological collection of human brains. And they would indeed use these brains to teach medical students around Indiana. That collection still stands today. The Mutter Museum, we have a lot of wet specimens, but also a lot of osteological specimens, a lot of bones. Another kind of specimen that's common is something called a corrosion, which is where doctors would, I did very bad in chemistry, so it's hard for me to explain exactly how this happens, but they would use various chemicals to kind of dissolve some aspects of the flesh, but keep others. It often looks like the person has been through a bit of a trauma or they've been in a fire. Students, middle schoolers would ask me a lot if the corrosions had been in fires. But it was another way for doctors to kind of show off different anatomy for medical students. So these were common teaching tools. It used to be that almost every medical school had some sort of anatomical collection like this, but we don't really anymore. So it used to be that every medical school had a pathological collection. Now they're really, really hard to find. The Mutter doesn't have a lot of contemporaries. We're really the largest, most visited medical collection in the United States. And that's because around the 1940s, there started to be better ways to educate medical students. So if you can imagine, you put a piece of flesh in a jar, even if you're preserving it with formaldehyde, it kind of starts to lose color over time, it loses shape. Some of the specimens in the Mutter Museum, I'll admit, I looked at them and I'm like, I have no idea what that is. Thank goodness there's a label because that just looks like a fleshy blob to me. So you can imagine for medical students, if you can see a condition on a living patient instead of on a piece of flesh in a jar, that's a lot more educational. Because we now do specialized medicine instead of, doctors just being general practitioners, it's actually a lot easier to see a diversity of patients that have more of the medical conditions you're teaching in one place. So for example, Philadelphia, we had an eye hospital, a hospital just for, people with eye problems that they were seeking healthcare for. So you can imagine if you're training to become an ophthalmologist, well, there's a lot of opportunities to learn on living bodies instead of looking at eyes in jars. Children's hospitals, of course, we now have lots and lots of specialized hospitals where medical students can see living patients. There's also, we now have textbooks where we can look at images. Sometimes there's videos. You can look up all kinds of medical videos now of how to do a surgery or what a certain medical condition looks like. 3D models like we have, our good old classroom skeletons. There's just so many other ways to teach medicine now that don't involve putting a piece of human body in a jar. So a lot of medical schools actually got rid of their pathological specimens a long, long time ago. And it's hard to find museums that still have them. So medical museums are a bit of an anomaly, oh my goodness, they're a bit of an anomaly in the museum world because they're not really used the way they used to be. The Mutter Museum is now open to the public, but it wasn't until the 1970s, 1980s. It used to be only open to medical students. And there are some museums that are still closed to the public today. So very few of these collections left. These are kind of the big six that I looked at for my thesis. The one on the upper left is the National Museum of Health and Medicine in DC. That used to be the Army Medical Museum. It was started during the Civil War. There was a circular that went around asking doctors who were treating soldiers, hey, if you see something interesting, maybe save that and send that to Washington, DC. We're making a museum. So that's how that museum started. It's now in Silver Springs, Maryland. Also, the Warren Anatomical Museum is at Harvard. The Cushing Center is in Yale. That is their medical library, but they also have a large collection of human brains. The Maud Abbott Medical Museum, featuring the wonderful Dr. Rick Fraser, who I interviewed for my thesis, that's up in Canada at, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the name, but that is at a school in Canada. We also have the Indiana Medical History Museum, as I've mentioned before, and the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, where I worked in grad school. So for my thesis, I also interviewed professionals at the Warren Anatomical Museum, the Cushing Center, and the Maud Abbott Medical Museum to talk to them about, well, what do you do with your human remains? How do you reckon with this collection, since you have a similar collection to the Mutter? So as I was talking to these medical professionals, reading things online about what the public thought, I came across two kind of myths I wanted to address. One argument that I saw a lot of people make for why the Mutter Museum should not attempt to, reckon with its past or give back or repatriate or rebury any pieces of human remains is that medical consent, informed consent as it exists today, was not a concept back in the 1800s, and that we can't hold the actions of the past to the standards of the present. And this argument is correct. The idea of informed consent, as we know it today, where you're signing a form, the doctor's carefully explaining to you the medical procedure they're about to do. Before that Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, if you couldn't really consent to donate your body to science the same way we do before that act was passed. So that is true. That standard didn't exist back then. If we're going to say we're only going to display human remains where we have this signed informed consent, then that means anything prior to the 1960s, we don't have that hard signed modern consent to go with it. But I'd argue actually people were actively not consenting back then, even though they weren't actively signing a form that said no. The attitude towards donating your body to science today is, wow, that's great. What a wonderful gift you're making. In the past, as I said, being anatomized was considered part of someone's criminal punishment if they were executed. If you think about the importance of religion throughout history, A lot of religions believe that, you know, have various beliefs around death. Those beliefs are very sacred. Some religions believe that burial is important. That was true back then as it is today. So if you can imagine, that might go against someone's religious beliefs if their family, you know, gave them a loving burial and then they only later find out that burial was actually disturbed. That could actually, you know, really go against someone's religious beliefs. So something interesting that happened in the past that I've read lovely, wonderful papers by Margaret Sanford out of Philadelphia, and Bess Lovejoy. She works, she's a member of the Order of Good Death, Order of the Good Death. She wrote this article about body snatching and anatomy riots. So the anatomy riots were events in the 1700s, 1800s, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, where members of the public were so angry and so upset to discover that their loved ones had been taken out of their graves and used for dissections. Funnily enough, Alexander Hamilton was involved in one in New York where he was involved in kind of quelling this anatomy riot, which was a part that was left out of the musical, but I think is very interesting. There were some boys that were kind of, you know, being 12 years old, and they were being annoying. They were annoying a medical student who was working on a dissection in the upper window. And he turns to one of the boys, he holds an arm out the window, and he says, "This is your mother that I'm working on." The boy runs home. The medical student was right. His mother's grave had been robbed. And this sparked a big, you know, big riot. People were very angry to figure out that medical students had been taking these bodies. And this had been happening throughout history. This happened again in Philadelphia. People were generally really upset when they found out that a loved one's body had been taken out of their grave. So I'd argue that even though we didn't have, you know, the signed informed consent that someone said yes to their body to be donated, it was likely that a lot of these bodies that we have in medical museums, it's very likely that their loved ones, that person would not have consented if they were presented with this informed consent today. Another argument that I found was that there's just no way of identifying who these remains belong to, right? A doctor's doing a dissection, he just takes something, who knows who that belonged to? And sometimes this is correct, sometimes there is no way of knowing, but actually sometimes we can figure out who remains belong to. There's a group I've been involved with called Finding Ceremony. They've been focused on the Penn Museum, and they've been trying to see repatriation and reburial for the Morton collection, which is a collection of, oh goodness, thousands of human skulls that were largely taken again without consent. Particularly, they are looking at the skulls of some Black Philadelphians. They've been able to identify who one of these people was. His name was John Voorhees. They did some genealogy research, found out actually not only was he Black, but he also had Native American ancestry. So his remains are subject to NAGPRA, which means that they should be repatriated to the people or the nation, the indigenous nation that he was a part of. So they've been doing some work, doing some genealogical research, and actually sometimes you're able to figure out going through doctors' journals, other resources. I mean, if you look at the Mutter Museum, you could look at their website, the library's website. They have correspondence, minutes, financial notes. They have, you know, so many different kinds of records that you can go through. I was talking about this with one of my professors. She works for the Institute of Science History in Philadelphia. She also did her thesis back in 1999 on a similar topic. And she was mentioning that sometimes you can look at a doctor's journal, see that he was treating a patient with a specific condition, and then look at, you know, what he donated to a pathological collection, kind of match up. Oh, he was treating someone with malaria, and here's this tissue with malaria that was donated around the same time. Sometimes if you do the research, you can actually identify who some of these tissues did belong to, which then means sometimes you can identify descendants and just let them know, hey, we have your great, 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 great aunt's remains. Where would you like to go from here? So it's important that it does take a lot of work to do this genealogical research, but we don't want to just write off and assume, hey, we can never ever know who this person was, because sometimes we can. So how do we talk to people about this? Hey, we have all these remains. They didn't come to us in the most ethical way. What do we do? Again, I'm by no means a medical ethicist. But this was my job at two different museums. That's me at the Indiana Medical History Museum, unlocking that dead house to take people inside. I also worked again at the Mutter Museum. I'd like to call myself a middle school wrangler because that was most of my job, was getting middle schoolers through the museum, trying to have this conversation with a bunch of kids who were just really excited to see a dead body. So here's what I learned in interacting with people. What I learned was that visitors actually really like human stories. They're, they're attracted to the macabre things. I think a lot of us are. I love true crime. A lot of people are into true crime, ghost stories. We're a little bit morbidly curious to see a human body, but also people were really interested in those human stories beyond the human remains. When I worked at the Indiana Medical History Museum, people weren't so interested in this clinical laboratory, the histology lab. They liked it, they were interested, but what they were really excited about was the history of Central State Hospital. Almost every time, I would take people through these two labs and then I'd take them to the library. And by that point, they'd go, okay, when are we going to get to see where the patients actually stayed? And I'd have to explain to them. I actually had a map in the library I could use to explain this. Almost all of these buildings are gone now. The dorms were all torn down when the hospital closed in I believe it was 1994. Most of those buildings had already been torn down. They had greatly downsized before they closed. We have a lot of artifacts relating to doctors' stories, not so much relating to patient stories. But I found that visitors were actually really disappointed to hear this. They wanted to hear about what life was like with a medical condition or what it was like to be a patient at this hospital. This was something that Melissa Graff at the center at the Cushing Center at Yale, she agreed with me on this. She said, there's a lot of ways that we can center doctor stories, but maybe we can center patient stories too. Another lesson I found was that visitors can actually accept mural ambiguity really, really well. Sometimes I think as museum professionals, we're afraid to kind of leave a question open or let the visitors decide for themselves. But I actually had great success just telling middle schoolers, hey, this is kind of an ethical dilemma. What do you guys think? Was it okay? So what I have here on the left, this is a drawing of the soap lady. She is a body that has been saponified. Again, this is a complicated chemical process, but it is a natural process where if a body is buried in the right conditions, it can actually turn to a soapy wax-like substance called adipocere. She was taken out of her grave and brought to the Mutter Museum in the 1870s. So I would explain the story of how she came to the museum to my medical students. I would explain that one of the physicians paid $7.50 for her body and purchased her. And because of that, we still don't know who she is. And I would explain to them, we have this here. What do you all think? And they, that's the very first stop on the tour. She's the very first thing they see. And I found they were actually, they weren't horrified to learn that, oh my gosh, this museum at one point stole, like we have to leave. They were actually open to that conversation of, oh, I think it's okay she's here, or I'd like to see her reburied. Similar situation with Einstein's brain. Einstein was not okay with being dissected after he died. He specifically wanted to be cremated. He didn't want people to have like a shrine that they could come to worship at. The physician who was dissecting him decided he was going to take that brain anyway. Long story short, if you're interested in learning more, it does have its own Wikipedia page, Einstein's brain. It has been on many wild adventures, but pieces of it are now at the Mutter Museum. And again, similar, I would be very honest with students about the fact that it was stolen. I would say that, Einstein's son did sort of give consent after the fact, and that's why we have it now. But again, students were okay with this. They weren't immediately offended, turned away. What you're seeing on this t-shirt design is the Hurdle Skull collection at the Mutter Museum. Again, this was a doctor who was collecting human skulls. A lot of those labels will say this was a person who died by suicide. This was, taken from a grave. There are some ancient Egyptian skulls on there, so we know those were probably just snatched up. No one was probably asked about those or they were purchased. But again, I would tell my students, hey kids, do you think this is how doctors do research today? They'd be like, no, it's probably not great that they did this. So I actually found that these specimens could actually be a tool to have these moral conversations, that we didn't have to ignore these moral ambiguities. We could talk about them, and it was actually very successful. Students enjoyed it. The third thing that I noticed was that visitors feel human emotions, connections to the human remains. I think this is a big reason why people were so upset about the Mutter Museum, the idea of the Mutter Museum potentially taking things off display. Is because people do feel human connections, emotions with these remains. What I'm showing you here, this was a project done at the Indiana Medical History Museum called Rehumanizing the Specimens, where the old labels prior to 2019, they had been just typed up versions of what the physicians wrote for their medical students. They were very clinical. But after a lot of research, the museum also put up new labels that told about who the patient was. So when I was a docent at the Indiana Medical History Museum, people would usually come into that room with the human brains, and they would be like making zombie jokes or just kind of, making um, kind of maybe inappropriate statements, that nobody was intentionally being hurtful. I think it's just kind of an awkward situation to walk into a room full of brains and not really know how to handle it. But once I explained what the second pair of labels was, why it was there, I noticed, changes on people's faces. People instantly got it when I explained, oh, it's important we remember these brains as human, instead of just as someone who had a medical condition. And people instantly connected with that. They would spend time reading the labels. They would mention, oh, I'm from this town too, or look, she was also a mother. I found that changing the interpretation really had allowed people to form those human connections, and see the remains as more than just remains. I also wanted to mention again Carol Orzel, who donated her body to the Mutter Museum in 2018. So she also gave us her jewelry. She didn't just give us her body. And this is so special because visitors love this. They love seeing her. They love seeing that costume jewelry. It really gives us a sense of her personality. I would end every tour with Carol Orzel because I wanted people to understand, look, Carol had these jewelry, she had these personal belongings, she had people who loved her and cared about her. Think of everybody else in this museum. They all did too. We just don't have the records for them like we have for Carol. And people really resonated with that. And I'm so grateful to Carol Orzel still that she made this gift to the Mutter Museum. So what now? Knowing what we know about, how these remains got to the museums, some approaches we can take to talking to visitors. There's a few solutions, but there's no one correct answer. I have my opinions, but of course my opinions are by no means the correct opinions. There's still a lot of discourse, a lot of people who think different things, and this is totally okay. So one approach would be adding more context. In an interview with Dominic Hall, who curates the Warren Anatomical Museum, he wrote that he is totally okay with writing a lot for labels when they display human remains. He was just saying, the need to contextualize these things, explain why we have them, what they're used for is so high. I don't care if it's boring. Which really goes a lot against what we as museum professionals are taught. We're taught to keep your labels short and snappy. No one's going to read them. People don't want to read a book in a museum. No one wants to read a book standing up. But he was saying, I think in this case, it's okay. I just need people to understand where these remains came from. And that's similar to what the Indiana Medical History Museum did with their rehumanizing the specimens. They did put up a lot of text, but I do think it's important text. Visitors might not go through and read every single label next to every single brain, but they do get the idea that, hey, there's a reason why this is here. Another similar approach would be taking different educational initiatives to build empathy. This was something really interesting that Dr. Fraser told me about, the Maud Abbott Medical Museum. What he does every year, there's a project that they do with the medical students at this university, called Rehumanizing the Specimens. Or I'm sorry, not Rehumanizing the Specimens, it's called Immortalizing the Mortal, where what they would do, he took, for example, this is a wax moulage of a person with ichthyosis, which is a dermatological condition. And they asked students to create songs or poetry or art pieces, kind of thinking about what it would be like to have a visible condition like this, where people are you look physically different, asking people to empathize with that. So I thought that was a really neat way of kind of flipping the script and asking people to think more deeply about the human remains, the medical conditions in this collection. Melissa Graff again was mentioning focus more on the patients, less on the doctors. That's another way to build up that empathy. Another thing medical museums can do is kind of structure access. This is something that Dominic Hall does at the Warren Anatomical Museum, where a lot of the times it's not super open to the public. A lot of those collections are only open to school groups. So that way there's always a docent, there's always someone there that can contextualize what students are seeing. So there's me giving a tour at the Indiana Medical History Museum, but also you can do, lessons for students. Lots of different ways to kind of maybe think more carefully about, do we want this to be just open to the public so anybody can come in? Do we want people to come in, but they're only able to give tours, or do we want to just have docents on staff so that if people have questions, we can explain? Kind of thinking maybe we can be less of a traditional museum and more of a museum that offers these really structured programs. Another approach would be just being very careful about what you put out on display and how you interpret it. If anyone recognizes this man on the left, his name is Phineas Gage. There's actually a 3D print of, I believe it's a 3D print. There's a model of his skull at the Galore. What happened? This man, a rail spike went through his head, but he survived. He lost some brain matter. He actually helped us figure out what parts of your brain do what things because of his personality change after he lost parts of his brain matter. But his skull's become very, very famous. I put him here because Dominic Hall at the Warren Anatomical Museum has said that Phineas Gage is one of the few specimens that they will now put out on display because there was some aspect of consent when he was donated. Now, Phineas himself did not consent, his mother consented, so Dominic was very clear to me that this is a consent narrative, as he called it. It's not consent as he would like it, but he puts him out compared to other specimens it's like we have no consent. These were likely taken from a medical dissection. Dr. Frazier also talked to me about being careful about what you're putting on display, saying, is it worth the emotional trauma we're going to put the visitor through with seeing this? What's the educational value in a specimen? He said, for example, I wouldn't put out something that had like a knife in it. Melissa Graff was also talking to me about fetal remains, which can be a very sensitive topic. We have a lot of remains of fetuses and young children at the Mutter Museum. So she was mentioning, is it always worth, do we want to put out this object that can potentially be very upsetting to someone, or do we need to display it in a different way? The final approach, repatriation, reburial. We can do some research. If we can identify the person's family, that's great. Ask them what they want to do. Let them have that power, decide from there what they want to do with the fact that, their great someone's brain or arm is in the collection. Some medical museums might also take the initiative themselves if they figure out, okay, we've exhausted all our resources and we don't know who this person is. Let's find somewhere to bury. The Penn Museum, as I mentioned, they are doing this very soon where they will be reburying some skulls. People are not super pleased with this because they don't believe the Penn Museum has exhausted all their options to identify who these people are before they are buried. So if you see that in the news, that's why it's a controversial decision, because there are descendant groups in Philadelphia, a Black descendant group that has said, hey, we'd really like to know who these people are so that we can contact their opposite of ancestors, their people who they would have been an ancestor of, and let them have that be the person to decide what happens. So those are some options that medical museums can take, but there is no one right or wrong answer. It's a very, very complicated decision, as you might be able to imagine. But that's what I have for you today. That's what my thesis was analyzing, what can we do as educators? What can we do as people who are interested in medical museums? Those are kind of some of the ethical dilemmas museums are facing, some potential solutions. But I really appreciate everyone tuning in today. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about those. But thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Kellyn. That was very fascinating and important work that you've done so far.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Kelly.
Yeah, really powerful, very powerful.
I definitely went on an emotional journey when I worked at the Mutter Museum. I had wanted to work there since I was 12 because I thought brains were really cool. And I thought that was super interesting that we had some at the Mutter Museum. But then the more I studied the history of medicine, the more I learned about where these specimens came from, the less sure I felt about my decision to work there. So I did think it was really important to think about, what are we going to do going forward with these remains that we have.
Absolutely,
Uh,
absolutely. Sarah, do you have any questions or comments for Kellyn?
Oh, let me jump on here. First of all, thank you so much for
Oh,
this.
thank you
This
for
was really
coming.
intriguing and really interesting, and it's a very topical conversation, especially kind of teetering that line between NACRA um human remains versus the medical, and kind of
Exactly.
towing that line is it's really interesting that you brought that up too, because I feel like a lot of people are starting to become more aware of NACRA, but also, as you mentioned, I think I did hear about the Penn Museum and that the human remain collections and kind of the ethical surroundings by it. It was really, really good. My only question was, you mentioned in the 40s that a lot of medical schools got rid of their specimens. Did they end
Yeah.
up donating them to museums or whatever happened, or did they just kind of keep it out of sight?
A lot of them were disposed of. That's actually the topic of, oh my goodness, I wish I could remember her name, but there was someone who presented at this year's LAMPS conference. LAMPS is it's an association of librarians, archivists, medical professionals, and historic, oh my goodness, but in historic, in history of medical sciences, I believe. But it's a group of medical historians, people who work at medical museums. This is actually the subject of someone's research right now because we don't know where a lot of these remains went.
Mhm.
A lot of them were probably cremated or buried. Some of them might still be in closets somewhere. I know Yale with their Cushing Center at one point, that was kind of their situation where they just had all these human remains, and for a while they didn't talk about the fact that they had these human remains.
Mhm.
But now with the Cushing Center, they are on display. Yeah, so it's tricky. We don't know where all of those went. One paper that I looked at for my thesis was actually about German medical museums that realized some of those bodies that they had were victims of the Holocaust.
Oh,
So they
wow.
were very quick after they realized they wanted those gone. They wanted to bury them so fast. And that was controversial as well for the similar reason to what the Penn Museum is going through, where people were saying, wait a minute, I wanted to know who that was. Was that a loved one? Could we have found their family? So it's definitely very tricky trying to figure out what's the best way to bury these specimens or give them to a loved one. Yeah, it was very, very interesting to hear about and think about those difficult conversations.
Yeah, there's a lot of not only again Native American and Indigenous peoples repatriation, but there's also a lot of Black communities that want repatriations too.
Mhm.
When I was doing my contract work in Tulsa, there was a huge movement surrounding like the 100 commemoration of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and there was a lot of people up
Yes.
in arms about kind of the remains of those who died during the massacre, and there's still repatriation acts
Oh
because
my
of it.
gosh. I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to look into that. That's yeah. Yeah, it's scary when you think about how many museums there are that have these human remains still. It's definitely more than you would think.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Kellyn.
Well, thank you all so much
I,
for coming.
yeah, this was very informative and informational, and I hope that more people will look at what you have presented.
Sure.
It will be on our YouTube channel for eternity, so hopefully we'll get
Perfect. Well,
some
again,
views
I'm
there.
not an expert, but these are my opinions based on me working in museums that have human remains. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, I had part-time jobs, I had internships. Like I'm by no means like even the most expertise person that worked at those museums. My opinions are, of course, my own and not reflective of those institutions. But I am very grateful to everyone who worked there, was such a mentor to me in this work. Definitely.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you for taking your time to be with us tonight.
Thank you all for joining.
And you have a good time in Oklahoma.
Oh, thank you. All right, well, have a good night, everyone. I can't see my Facebook friends, but sending you sending you love as well.
Okay, good night.
Awesome.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everybody. Thank you. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.